The photograph stared back at Elena Martinez from her laptop screen, and she realized with bone-chilling certainty that the missing woman looked exactly like her. Not similar, identical, down to the distinctive scar above her left eyebrow and the unusual amber flecks in her green eyes. Elena's coffee mug slipped from trembling fingers, shattering against her apartment floor as she leaned closer to the news article. Sarah Chun, 28, disappeared from her downtown apartment 3 weeks ago. Police have no leads. The woman in the photo could have been Elena's twin if Elena had a twin, which she didn't. At least, she didn't think she did. Her mind raced back to the gaps in her childhood memories, the ones her adoptive parents always dismissed as normal. "Children forget things, sweetheart," her mother would say whenever Elena asked about the years before age 7. But this photograph suggested something far more sinister than childhood amnesia. Elena screenshotted the image with shaking hands, her heart hammering against her ribs as she began researching Sarah Chun's life. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Sarah worked as a graphic designer, just like Elena. Sarah had been adopted at age 7, just like Elena. Sarah lived alone, preferred tea over coffee, and had a distinctive birthmark on her right shoulder details that made Elena's blood run cold because she shared every single one. The similarities weren't coincidental. They were impossible unless someone had been orchestrating their lives from the shadows. Elena spent the next 4 hours diving deeper into Sarah's digital footprint, her anxiety mounting with each parallel she uncovered. They'd both attended art school, though in different states. They'd both had their first serious relationships and the same year. Both struggled with the same recurring nightmare about drowning in dark water. And both had unexplained scars on their palms that their adoptive families claimed came from childhood accidents they couldn't remember. By midnight, Elena had filled 3 notebook pages with connections between her life and Sarah's. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate to be natural. Someone had been watching them, molding them, perhaps even controlling aspects of their development. But who and why? Elena's hands shook as she realized Sarah's disappearance might not be random. It might be a test run for what was planned for her. She tried calling the detective handling Sarah's case, but it went straight to voicemail. Elena left a rambling message about the similarities, knowing she sounded unhinged but unable to stop herself from sharing every detail. Sleep was impossible. She paced her apartment, checking locks and windows, jumping at every sound from the hallway. The rational part of her mind insisted she was overreacting, but her instincts screamed that she was in danger. The next morning brought a response she hadn't expected. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, Elena." Sarah didn't listen either. The message included a photograph, Sarah Chun tied to a chair in what looked like a basement, her eyes wide with terror. A newspaper dated just 3 days ago held up beside her face. Sarah was still alive, or had been 3 days ago. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized the implications. Someone was watching her, had been watching her investigation, and was now threatening her directly. Elena's first instinct was to run, pack everything and disappear before whoever had taken Sarah could take her too. But looking at Sarah's terrified face in the photograph, she knew she couldn't abandon the only person who might understand what was happening to them. If Sarah was her identical twin, separated at birth and placed with different families, then they were connected by more than appearance. They were connected by whatever twisted plan had shaped their lives. She made a decision that would change everything. Instead of running, she would find Sarah Chen. Elena grabbed her laptop, stuffed clothes into a backpack, and headed for her car. She had no idea who she was up against or what dangers awaited, but she couldn't live with the knowledge that her doppelganger was suffering somewhere while she did nothing. The photograph had shown her a truth she couldn't unsee, and now there was no turning back from whatever dark psychology had orchestrated their intertwined fates. Elena drove through the night toward the city where Sarah Chen had lived, her mind churning with questions that had no rational answers. The threatening text message played on repeat in her thoughts. But she'd made her choice. She wouldn't abandon someone who might be her twin to whatever monster had orchestrated their parallel lives. Every mile brought her closer to answers she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Sarah's apartment building stood in a gentrifying neighborhood where modern condos neighbored aging brownstones. Elena parked across the street and studied the building, noting the security cameras and wondering what they might have captured the night Sarah disappeared. The police report she'd found online mentioned no signs of forced entry, suggesting Sarah had known her abductor or been deceived into letting them inside. Elena approached the building manager, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who seemed eager to discuss the mysterious disappearance that had shaken the quiet building. Sarah was such a sweet girl, she confided, inviting Elena into the lobby. Always paid her rent early, never caused problems. That's why it was so strange when she missed her morning jog 3 weeks ago. Sarah never missed that jog, rain or shine. The conversation revealed disturbing details the news hadn't reported. Sarah had been receiving mysterious gifts in the weeks before her disappearance: expensive art supplies, flowers with no cards, and a vintage camera that Mrs. Rodriguez remembered because Sarah had seemed confused rather than pleased by it. She kept asking who they were from, but there was never any note, Mrs. Rodriguez explained. I told her she must have a secret admirer, but she seemed more worried than flattered. Elena's blood chilled as she recognized the pattern. She'd been receiving similar gifts over the past 2 months, high-end graphic design software she'd never ordered, a professional camera she'd assumed was a shipping mistake, and weekly flower deliveries she'd attributed to a mix-up with her neighbor. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Whoever had been preparing to take Sarah had been preparing to take her too. Using the pretense of being Sarah's cousin from out of town, Elena convinced Mrs. Rodriguez to let her see Sarah's apartment. The space felt eerily familiar, decorated in the same minimalist style Elena preferred, with the same plants by the windows and even the same brand of tea in the kitchen. But it was the art studio that made Elena's knees weak. Sarah's unfinished paintings were identical in style to Elena's own work, down to the color palette and brushstroke techniques they'd supposedly developed independently. Elena found Sarah's journal hidden behind a loose baseboard, a discovery that suggested Sarah had been as paranoid as Elena was becoming. The entries from the final weeks revealed Sarah's growing unease about the gifts, her suspicion that someone was following her, and most chillingly, her discovery of Elena's existence. "Found another woman online who looks exactly like me," Sarah had written. "Elena Martinez. Same scars, same eyes, same everything. This can't be coincidence. Someone's been playing with our lives like we're dolls in a dollhouse." The final entry, dated the night before Sarah's disappearance, sent ice through Elena's veins. "They called today. Said they're tired of waiting and it's time for the reunion. I don't know what that means, but I'm scared. If something happens to me, I hope Elena finds this. We're not just twins. We're part of something bigger and more terrifying than we ever imagined." Elena photographed every page of the journal before returning it to its hiding place. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. "You're in Sarah's apartment. How sentimental. Check your email." Elena's stomach dropped as she opened her email to find a video attachment. The timestamp showed it was recorded just minutes ago. Someone was watching her in real time. The video showed Elena inside Sarah's apartment, but the angle was impossible. The camera had to be hidden somewhere in the room, which meant whoever sent it had been inside recently, had been preparing for her arrival. Elena spun around, scanning every corner, every piece of furniture, feeling violated and trapped. The video continued playing, showing her finding the journal, reading the entries, her face displaying every emotion as she uncovered the truth. A new message appeared at the bottom of the video. "Sarah found out too much, just like you're doing now. But don't worry, Elena. The reunion she mentioned is still happening. You'll see her very soon." The video ended with a close-up of Elena's terrified face from just seconds earlier, driving home the point that she was being monitored constantly, that privacy was an illusion, and that she'd walked directly into the trap that had been set for her. Elena ran from the apartment, her heart pounding as she realized the magnitude of her situation. She wasn't just investigating Sarah's disappearance. She was living through the same psychological manipulation that had led to Sarah's capture. The gifts, the surveillance, the gradual revelation of their connection. It was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan designed to bring them together, whether they wanted it or not. Elena drove away from the building with the horrible certainty that she was no longer the hunter in this scenario. She had become the prey, just as Sarah had been before her. Elena checked into a motel 30 miles outside the city, paying cash and using a fake name as paranoia consumed her rational thoughts. The surveillance video had shattered any illusion of safety. Whoever was orchestrating this knew her every move before she made it. She spread Sarah's journal pages across the musty bedspread, searching for clues she might have missed, when her laptop chimed with an incoming video call from an unknown account. Against her better judgment, Elena answered. The screen filled with an image that made her blood freeze. Sarah Chun, alive but clearly captive, sitting in what appeared to be a sterile medical facility. Sarah looked directly into the camera, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "Elena," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they told me you'd be watching. They want me to explain everything." Elena gripped the laptop screen, her voice cracking as she responded, "Sarah, where are you? Are you hurt?" But Sarah continued as if following a script, her words measured and careful. "We're not twins, Elena. We're not even related by blood. We're something much more valuable to them. We're successful experiments in behavioral modification and psychological conditioning." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Sarah continued, explaining how they'd both been selected as children from different adoption agencies, chosen for specific genetic markers and psychological profiles. They separated us and placed us with carefully chosen families, then spent 20 years molding our personalities, our preferences, our talents. Every coincidence in our lives was planned. Every choice we thought was our own was actually programmed. Elena's world tilted on its axis as Sarah revealed the scope of their manipulation. The art schools they'd attended had special programs funded by the same research foundation. Their adoptive families had received monthly payments disguised as adoption support. Even their relationships had been influenced, the men they'd dated, the friends they'd made, the jobs they'd taken were all part of a vast psychological experiment designed to create two identical personalities from completely different genetic starting points. "They call it Project Mirror," Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "The goal was to prove that nature versus nurture is a false choice, that with enough control over environment and conditioning, they could create identical personalities regardless of genetics. We're living proof that free will is an illusion when someone has enough resources and patience to manipulate every aspect of your development." Elena felt sick as the implications crashed over her. Every decision she'd thought was uniquely her own, her love of art, her preference for solitude, her recurring nightmares, even her attraction to certain types of people had been carefully cultivated through years of subtle psychological manipulation. The gifts they'd been receiving weren't threats. They were rewards for following the behavioral patterns they'd been conditioned to follow. Sarah's expression grew more urgent as she leaned toward the camera. "They're not done with us, Elena. The experiment is entering its final phase. They want to see what happens when two artificially identical personalities are forced to interact, to compete, to make choices that reveal which aspects of our conditioning are strongest. But I've learned something they don't know I know." Elena held her breath as Sarah glanced over her shoulder before continuing in a rushed whisper. "There are others, Elena. We're not the only pair. They've been running this experiment for decades with different subjects, different variables. I've seen files, photographs of other women who looked like variations of us. Some experiments succeeded, some failed catastrophically. The failures, they didn't survive the final phase." The video call suddenly cut out, leaving Elena staring at her own reflection in the black screen. Her phone immediately buzzed with a text. "Sarah talks too much, just like you do. But don't worry, you'll be reunited soon. Check your email for your invitation to the final phase." Elena's hand shook as she opened the email to find coordinates. A date 3 days away, and a single line of instruction: come alone or Sarah dies. Elena stared at the coordinates, recognizing them as a location in the mountains about 4 hours away. The email included architectural plans for what looked like a research facility built into the mountainside, complete with observation rooms, living quarters, and what appeared to be testing chambers. At the bottom of the plans was a note in clinical handwriting: final phase, personality integration study. Subjects will be presented with survival scenarios designed to reveal authentic behavioral patterns versus conditioned responses. Successful integration will determine viability for mass implementation. Elena realized with growing horror that she and Sarah weren't just victims. They were prototypes for something much larger. If their experiment succeeded, it would prove that entire populations could be psychologically manipulated and controlled through environmental conditioning. They were living proof that democracy, free choice, and individual autonomy could be systematically destroyed without people even realizing it was happening. Elena closed her laptop and began planning her response. She could run, disappear completely, and hope they never found her. But that would mean abandoning Sarah to whatever fate awaited failed experiments. She could go to the authorities, but who would believe such an elaborate conspiracy, and how could she prove it before Sarah was killed? Or she could walk into their trap, knowing it was a trap, and hope that 20 years of psychological conditioning had somehow failed to completely destroy her capacity for genuine choice. Elena packed her few belongings and prepared to drive toward the coordinates. Knowing she was almost certainly walking toward her death, but unable to abandon the only person who truly understood what she'd experienced. As she started her car, Elena realized that her decision to save Sarah might be the first genuinely free choice she'd made in her entire adult life, and possibly the last choice she'd ever make. Elena arrived at the mountain facility as dawn broke over the peaks, the coordinates leading her to what appeared to be a luxury corporate retreat built into the mountainside. The deceptively pleasant exterior couldn't mask the sinister purpose hidden. Within, this was where 20 years of psychological manipulation would reach its conclusion. Elena parked her car and walked toward the main entrance, knowing she was expected, but hoping she still retained enough authentic self to surprise her captors. Dr. Marcus Winters greeted her in the lobby, a distinguished man in his 60s whose warm smile didn't reach his calculating eyes. "Elena, welcome to the Behavioral Research Institute. I'm so pleased you chose to join us for the culmination of Project Mirror. Sarah has been asking about you." His casual tone suggested this was a normal social gathering rather than the final phase of a decades-long psychological experiment designed to destroy human autonomy. Elena was escorted through corridors lined with observation windows and monitoring equipment, past laboratories where she glimpsed other subjects, some alone, some in pairs, all apparently unaware they were being studied like laboratory rats. Dr. Winters explained cheerfully that the facility housed multiple ongoing experiments in behavioral modification, social control, and psychological conditioning. "Your case with Sarah is our most successful twin study," he said proudly. as if discussing a prize-winning science project rather than human lives. Sarah waited in a comfortable living area that resembled a high-end apartment, except for the cameras in every corner and the subtle fact that the windows showed recorded footage of mountain views rather than the real world outside. Sarah looked physically unharmed but psychologically exhausted, her eyes lighting up with desperate hope when Elena entered. "I knew you'd come," she said, embracing Elena with surprising strength. "I knew they couldn't completely control that part of us." Dr. Winters explained the final phase with clinical detachment. Elena and Sarah would live together in the monitored apartment for 1 week, during which they would face a series of challenges designed to reveal their authentic personalities versus their conditioned responses. "We need to determine which aspects of your behavior are genuine psychological traits and which are products of our conditioning," he explained. "The successful integration of your personalities will provide the template for large-scale implementation." Elena realized the true horror of their situation. This wasn't just about them anymore. They were unwitting participants in developing a system for mass psychological control that could be applied to entire populations. Their conditioning had been a prototype for techniques that could make democracy impossible by ensuring people only made choices their controllers wanted them to make. The success of Project Mirror would mark the end of human free will as a meaningful concept. The first challenge came that evening, a staged emergency where they had to choose between saving themselves or risking everything to help strangers. Elena watched Sarah instinctively move to help others, recognizing the same conditioned altruism she felt herself. But as they worked together, Elena began noticing small differences, moments where Sarah's responses seemed slightly more authentic, less programmed than her own. Perhaps Sarah's later conditioning had been less thorough, or perhaps some aspect of her original personality had survived the decades of manipulation. Over the following days, each challenge revealed new layers of their psychological architecture. They faced moral dilemmas designed to test their ethical conditioning, problem-solving scenarios that explored their cognitive patterns, and social situations that examined their relationship dynamics. Elena realized she was watching Sarah gradually reclaim pieces of her authentic self, fighting against years of programming through sheer force of will and desperate hope. By the 5th day, Elena understood what she had to do. The cameras recorded everything, feeding data to researchers who were using their responses to refine techniques for mass psychological control. But Elena had discovered something the researchers hadn't anticipated. The very act of recognizing their conditioning was beginning to weaken its hold over them. Awareness was the antidote to manipulation, but only if they were willing to embrace the terrifying responsibility of genuine choice. Elena made her decision during the final challenge, a scenario designed to force them to compete for survival. Instead of following her conditioned responses, Elena chose to sacrifice herself so Sarah could escape. She created a distraction that would allow Sarah to reach the facility's communication center and expose Project Mirror to the world. "This is the first real choice I've made in 20 years, Elena told Sarah as alarms began blaring. "Make sure it counts," Sarah escaped into the mountains while Elena faced Dr. Winters and his team, who seemed genuinely surprised that their perfect experiment had chosen authentic sacrifice over conditioned self-preservation. Elena realized that their true failure wasn't in the psychological conditioning, it was in underestimating the human capacity to choose meaning over survival, love over self-interest, and authentic connection over programmed responses. Even after decades of manipulation, something essentially human had survived. Elena's sacrifice bought Sarah the time she needed to reach authorities and expose the facility. Within hours, federal agents raided the complex, finding evidence of illegal human experimentation, violations of informed consent, and a network of similar facilities operating worldwide. Elena survived the confrontation, though barely, and was eventually reunited with Sarah as they both began the difficult process of reclaiming their authentic selves from 20 years of psychological conditioning. Months later, as Elena testified before congressional committees and helped other Project Mirror survivors rebuild their identities, she realized that her decision to save Sarah had been the moment she truly became human again. The conditioning could control their preferences, influence their choices, and shape their personalities, but it couldn't completely destroy the capacity for self-sacrifice and authentic love that made them more than the sum of their programming. Elena and Sarah now work together, helping others recognize and break free from psychological manipulation in all its forms. They've learned that true freedom isn't the absence of influence, it's the awareness of influence, and the courage to choose authentically despite the programming that surrounds us all. Their story serves as a warning about the power of psychological manipulation and a testament to the resilience of human consciousness when faced with the ultimate choice between authentic humanity and programmed compliance. If you found Elena and Sarah's story as compelling as I did while creating it, please subscribe for more psychological thrillers that explore the darker corners of human nature. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of authentic choice over conditioning, and comment below about which moment in their journey affected you most. Your engagement helps me continue creating stories that matter, stories that challenge us to examine our own choices and fight for our authentic selves in a world full of subtle manipulation.